If you only had your last bit of money left, would you still give it away to someone in need, not knowing it could change your life forever? Or would you hold on to it, fearing what tomorrow might bring? Thunder boomed over Velmer City, shaking windows and making car alarms go off. Rain poured down like someone had knocked over a giant bucket in the sky. People hurried along the sidewalks, umbrellas up, jackets pulled tight, everyone rushing to get somewhere dry. No one noticed the old man sitting on the sidewalk. He was soaked from head to toe, leaning against a cracked brick wall like he had no more energy left. His clothes were thin and full of holes, his feet bare and resting in a puddle. A small, torn hat lay in front of him, catching more rain than money. He didn't beg, didn't call out, just sat there, staring at nothing. People walked past him without a second glance. The city was always busy, always loud. Another beggar on the street wasn't anything new. Some glanced at him but quickly looked away. No one wanted to feel guilty. And then came Aisha. She wasn't doing much better than the rest of the people in the rain. Actually, she was worse off. Her plastic sandals made squelching noises with every step. Her thin dress clung to her skin, and her heavy bag dug into her shoulder. She had just finished a long, tiring shift at Mama Ngozie's roadside restaurant, where she had been on her feet all day, dodging hot oil and impatient customers. She was starving. Her whole body ached. All she wanted was to get home, crawl on her tiny mattress, and forget this miserable day ever happened. But then she saw him. Something made her stop. Maybe it was the way he just sat there, not even flinching from the cold. Maybe it was the deep wrinkles on his face, telling stories of struggle and heartbreak. Or maybe it was because she knew that feeling of hopelessness all too well. She looked at the crumpled bills in her hand, just enough for the bus home. If she gave it away, she'd have to walk. And that was at least an hour in the rain. Her sandals would probably break, and she'd be even more exhausted tomorrow. She should keep the money. That was the smart thing to do. But Aisha had never been good at ignoring people in need. With a sigh, she bent down, her knees splashing into a puddle. "Baba," she said softly, using the respectful term for an elder. "Are you okay?" The man slowly opened his eyes. They were tired, distant, like he was lost in a dream he couldn't escape. He looked at her for a long moment, then down at the money in her hand. "I don't have much," Aisha admitted, suddenly embarrassed by how little she had to offer. "But maybe you can get something warm to eat." She placed the money into his cold, wrinkled hands. They were rough, like they had worked hard once upon a time. For the first time, he really looked at her. Not a quick glance, but deep, as if he was searching for something inside her. His gaze made her feel strange, like he could see straight into her heart. Then, he muttered something under his breath. Aisha frowned. The words were raspy, quiet, in a language she didn't recognize. She leaned in, hoping to catch what he said, but the rain swallowed the words. "Sorry," she asked. The old man gave a small smile, the kind that made shivers run down her spine. Then, just as suddenly as he had spoken, he closed his eyes again, his head dipping like he was too tired to stay awake any longer. Aisha hesitated. Should she ask him if he needed anything else? But what could she do? She had nothing herself. With a final glance at the beggar, she stood up, pulling her bag higher onto her shoulder. The rain was still falling hard, and her walk home was going to be miserable. But for some reason, she didn't feel bad about giving up her bus fare. She took one last look over her shoulder before walking away. What she didn't see was a pair of eyes watching from across the street. A man in a black coat stood under the awning of a closed shop, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on her. He had been watching the whole time. He had seen how many people passed by, pretending not to notice. He had seen some hesitate, reach into their pockets, and then shake their heads and walk away. But she had stopped. She had given, even when she had nothing to spare. The man in the black coat nodded to himself, then stepped back into the shadows, vanishing into the night. Before we continue, do me a quick favor. Hit that like button, drop a comment with your thoughts so far, and most importantly, subscribe. You won't want to miss what's coming next. And hey, share this with someone who loves a good twist. Alright, let's get back to the story. A loud banging on the wooden door jolted Aisha awake. She groaned, barely able to open her eyes. Her body ached from yesterday's double shift, and her feet felt like they had been trampled by a herd of elephants. For a moment, she considered ignoring the noise, pretending it was part of her dream. But the banging came again, louder, angrier. Aisha, Zainab, open this door before I break it down. It was the landlord, Mr. Salisu, and he was in one of his moods. Zainab, lying next to her on their small mattress, groaned and pulled the thin blanket over her head. Your turn, she mumbled sleepily. Aisha sighed, pushing herself up. Their tiny room was barely big enough for the mattress, a small wooden table, and their few belongings scattered around. The ceiling fan creaked as it spun lazily, doing little to ease the morning heat. She rubbed her eyes, shuffled to the door, and opened it just a crack. Mr. Salisu stood there, arms crossed over his big belly, his face twisted in annoyance. It's the 10th of the month, he said, tapping his foot. Where's my money? Aisha forced a smile. Good morning, sir. He wasn't impressed. I didn't come for greetings, Aisha. Do you have my rent? Or should I start looking for new tenants? Her stomach twisted. She had some money saved up, but it wasn't enough. If she gave him what she had, she wouldn't have enough for food and transport. She swallowed hard. I just need a little more time, sir. I promise I'll. You promised last month, too, he interrupted, glaring at her. And the month before that. I'm tired of promises. If I don't get my money by the weekend, you both better start packing. Before she could respond, he turned and stomped away. Aisha sighed and shut the door, leaning against it. Zainab, we're in trouble. Zainab peeked out from under the blanket. We've been in trouble. This is just deeper trouble. She stretched lazily. Don't worry, something will come up. Aisha shook her head. That was always Zainab's attitude. Worry later, sleep now. But she couldn't afford to be that relaxed. She rushed through her morning routine, changed into her work dress, and tied her hair back. She had no time for breakfast. She grabbed her bag and dashed out, calling over her shoulder, Pray Madame Gozi doesn't fire me today. The restaurant was already buzzing when she arrived. The smell of frying oil and spices filled the air, mixing with the shouts of customers placing orders. The morning rush was in full swing. Aisha, she froze. That voice, that tone. Slowly, she turned to see Madame Ngozi standing by the counter, hands on her wide hips, a frown deepening the lines on her round face. You are late. Aisha opened her mouth to explain, but Madame Ngozi raised a hand. I don't want excuses. This is the last time I'm warning you. One more day like this, and you're out. Aisha nodded quickly. I understand, Ma. It won't happen again. It better not. With that, Madame Ngozi spun around and went back to yelling at the cook. Aisha let out a breath and rushed to grab her notepad and tray. The other waitresses smirked at her as she walked past. She ignored them and got to work. The next few hours were a blur of rushing back and forth, taking orders, balancing trays, and dodging hot splashes from the kitchen. Customers barely looked at her as she served them, their focus on their food and conversations. She was invisible to them, just part of the background, except for the ones who made things harder. Hey, sweetheart, a man called as she placed a plate in front of him. Why are you frowning? Smile a little, nah. Aisha forced the smallest smile she could manage. The man chuckled, elbowing his friend. See how fine she is. You single, baby girl? She pretended not to hear and walked away. At the counter, her coworker Blessing was chatting with the cashier, giggling. Aisha caught the last part of their conversation. And now nobody has seen him for months. Can you imagine? Blessing was saying, eyes wide with excitement. Who? Aisha asked as she filled a glass of water. Blessing turned to her. Julius Odwale, the billionaire. Haven't you heard? He disappeared months ago, and his family is panicking. Some people say he's dead, but the police haven't found anything. Aisha frowned. A whole billionaire disappeared just like that? Blessing nodded dramatically. Yes. Poof. Gone. Some say he ran away. Others say something bad happened to him. Aisha shook her head. Rich people problems. Blessing laughed. I wish I had rich people problems. Aisha sighed and grabbed her tray. She didn't have time to think about billionaires. She had her own problems, problems that didn't come with private jets and mansions. problems like paying rent and keeping her job. As she turned to serve another table, she had no idea that her life was about to change in ways she could never imagine. The Oldwale mansion stood like a king's palace in the heart of Velmer City, its massive gates guarded by men in black suits. The driveway, long and lined with palm trees, led up to the grand entrance, where gold-trimmed doors gleamed under the evening lights. Inside, the walls were covered with expensive paintings, the chandeliers sparkled, and everything smelled of wealth. But tonight, the air was thick with something else, greed. In the large dining hall, a group of well-dressed family members sat around a long glass table. The usual laughter and clinking of glasses were absent. Instead, there was tension. At the head of the table sat Deli Oldwale, Julius Oldwale's only son. His suit was sharp, his wristwatch worth more than a luxury car, but his eyes held impatience. He tapped his fingers on the table, glancing at the man sitting across from him, his uncle, Chief Omelade. Omelade was a man who carried power like a second skin. His agbada, a rich blue, flowed around him like a royal robe. He had the calmness of a man who had seen many battles and won most of them. He sipped from a glass of wine before finally speaking. "We need to move fast," Omelade said, his deep voice cutting through the silence. "The longer we wait, the harder this becomes." Deli sighed and leaned back. "I know, Uncle, but the board won't approve anything without proof." From the far end of the table, a slim man adjusted his glasses. This was Barrister Femi, the family lawyer. Unlike the others, he wasn't there for power, only to do his job. And his job, at the moment, was to warn them. "The company board is skeptical," Barrister Femi said. "Without official proof of Mr. Julius Oldwale's death, they will not transfer control to anyone." Omelade clicked his tongue. "They act as if the company belongs to them." "Well, legally, it belongs to Julius," Femi reminded them. "And until he is declared dead, nobody can touch his properties." Deli rubbed his temple. "It's been months. No calls, no sightings, no trace of him anywhere. We all know he's not coming back. But the law does not work on assumptions," Femi said firmly. "To declare him dead, you need solid evidence." Omelade set down his glass. "Then we find evidence." Deli narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean?" Omelade smiled slowly. "We don't sit here and wait. We go out and look for him, dead or alive. If he's dead, we get the proof we need. If he's alive," he paused, then shrugged. "Well, accidents happen every day." Silence. Deli's fingers tightened around his glass. He had thought about this before, but never said it out loud. Killing his own father? Even for money, the idea made something in his stomach turn. But then again, his father had never treated him as an equal. Always criticizing, always doubting his abilities. Maybe it was time to take what was rightfully his. Deli took a slow breath and nodded. "I'll hire someone. A private investigator." Femi adjusted his glasses again. "Be careful. If this gets out, it could destroy everything." Deli smirked. "Don't worry, Barrister. Discretion is key." As the meeting ended, a plan was already forming in his mind. He would find his father, one way or another. Aisha's phone buzzed loudly, shaking against the wooden table where she had placed it. She frowned. Nobody ever called her unless it was Zainab borrowing money she didn't have or Madame Ngozi reminding her of extra shifts. Wiping her hands on her apron, she picked up the phone. "Hello," she answered cautiously. A crisp female voice replied, "Good afternoon. Am I speaking with Miss Aisha Lawal?" Aisha hesitated. Nobody ever called her Miss. It felt too fancy for her life. "Yes. Who is this?" "My name is Mrs. Adewale. I'm calling from Oldwale Holdings. We came across your details and would like to offer you a job." Aisha almost laughed. "Me? A job?" "Yes. A domestic role in one of our private residences. Good pay, full accommodation, and benefits." Aisha's mind spun. This had to be a scam. Nobody offered good jobs out of nowhere. "I never applied for any job with you." The woman chuckled. "Sometimes the right people find you instead. If you're interested, an official car will pick you up tomorrow morning. Think about it." Before Aisha could ask another question, the line went dead. That night, she tossed and turned, debating whether to accept the offer. It sounded too good to be true. But then she remembered the landlord's threats, her overdue rent, and her miserable job at the restaurant. Maybe, just maybe this was her way out. By morning, she had made her decision. At exactly 9 a.m., a sleek black SUV pulled up outside her building. The driver, dressed in a suit, stepped out and opened the door for her. Aisha hesitated, looking around as if someone would jump out and yell, "Gotcha! It's a prank." Zainab, standing beside her, nudged her. "Enter Jair. If they kidnap you, I'll tell the police you left willingly." "Very comforting," Aisha muttered before getting in. The ride was smooth, the car's interior smelling of leather and something expensive she couldn't name. As they drove further, the city's noise faded, replaced by the quiet elegance of the wealthy district. The car finally stopped in front of an enormous mansion on the outskirts of the city. Aisha's mouth fell open. Tall iron gates swung open, revealing a house that looked like something out of a movie. Marble steps, massive pillars, and windows so clean they sparkled in the sunlight. She was still gawking when the driver led her inside. The living room was just as grand. High ceilings, gold accents, and furniture that probably cost more than her entire street. A woman in a smart blue uniform approached her. "Welcome, Miss Aisha. Please, wait here." Before she could respond, footsteps echoed down the grand staircase. A man appeared at the top. Aisha gasped. It was the beggar, but he wasn't a beggar anymore. His dirty rags were gone, replaced by an elegant suit. His scruffy beard was neatly trimmed, and his once tired eyes now held a sharp, knowing gleam. He walked down the stairs with the confidence of someone who owned everything in sight. "I told you we'd meet again," he said, a smile playing on his lips. Aisha's knees nearly gave out. The next few moments passed in a blur. Aisha barely registered the housekeeper's polite instructions or the way the driver quietly excused himself. Her eyes remained fixed on the man who, just days ago, had been shivering in the rain, clutching a piece of bread like it was his last meal. "Sir," she finally managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was you." The man chuckled, stepping closer. "Yes, I had to see with my own eyes who still had kindness in their heart." Aisha's mouth went dry. "I don't understand. Who are you?" Before he could answer, Mrs. Adewale returned, her heels clicking against the marble floor. "Miss Aisha, let me properly introduce you. This is Mr. Julius Odwale." Aisha blinked. She had heard that name before. The missing billionaire. The man everyone thought was dead. The man whose family was already planning to inherit his fortune. But you? "I was testing humanity," Julius said simply. "And you, Aisha, passed." She shook her head, trying to process everything. Why? Why pretend to be a beggar? His smile faded slightly. "Because wealth blinds people. I wanted to know if there was anyone out there who would help a man with nothing, expecting nothing in return." Aisha swallowed hard. "So the job?" Julius nodded. "The job is real. But you won't just be a worker here. You'll be part of something much bigger." Aisha's stomach flipped. This was more than just a job. This was the beginning of something she didn't fully understand yet. Aisha had expected to be handed a mop and bucket, maybe a long list of chores, washing endless dishes, scrubbing floors, or ironing expensive clothes she could never afford. But instead, she was led to a cozy sitting room, where Julius Odwale sat in a deep leather chair, sipping tea like he had all the time in the world. She stood awkwardly by the door, waiting for instructions. When none came, she cleared her throat. What exactly will I be doing, sir?" Julius looked up, smiling faintly. "No need to call me sir. Just Julius is fine." Aisha hesitated. It felt wrong to call a billionaire by his first name, but she nodded. "Okay, Julius, what's my job?" "To sit," he said simply, gesturing to the chair across from him. Aisha frowned. "Sit," he chuckled. "Yes, sit. Talk. Keep me company." She blinked. Of all the jobs in the world, this was the strangest. "That's all. For now." Still confused, Aisha lowered herself onto the chair. The cushions were so soft, she almost sighed out loud. Julius took another sip of tea, studying her over the rim of his cup. "Tell me, Aisha," he began, "what do you think about life? Aisha frowned. That's a big question. Take your time. She exhaled, thinking, life is unfair. Some people have everything. Some have nothing. The ones with everything don't notice the ones with nothing. Julius raised an eyebrow. And do you resent them for it? Aisha hesitated. No, not really. I mean, it's not their fault they were born rich. But I do wonder, if I had money, would I be different? Julius smiled. And do you think you would? Aisha shrugged. I hope not. There was a thoughtful silence. Then Julius leaned forward. You gave away your last money to a man you thought was a beggar. What? Aisha shifted in her seat. I don't know. It felt right. He looked like he needed it more than I did. You didn't expect anything in return? She scoffed. A beggar? What would he give me? Julius chuckled. Exactly. The conversation continued, Julius asking questions that felt oddly personal. Aisha answered honestly, her words flowing easier than she expected. She told him about her struggles, her late parents, her dream of owning a small restaurant one day. She spoke about Zainab, her only family left, and their constant hustle to make ends meet. Julius listened, nodding occasionally. He didn't interrupt, didn't judge. He just listened. It was strange but comforting. After an hour, Mrs. Adewale appeared at the door. Mr. Julius, your lunch is ready. Julius glanced at Aisha. Are you hungry? Aisha's stomach growled in response. She hadn't eaten since morning. She smiled sheepishly. A little. Julius grinned. Join me then. Meanwhile, across the city, Deli Odwale paced in his luxurious office. His jaw clenched as he listened to the private investigator's report. We found something, the investigator said. A man matching your father's description was seen in a wealthy estate outside the city. Deli stiffened. Are you sure? The investigator handed him a photo. It was blurry, but the man in the image had the same sharp features as his father. Deli's grip tightened on the paper. His father was alive. That meant trouble. Back at the mansion, Aisha followed Julius into the dining room. The table was long enough to seat 20 people, but only 2 plates were set. Sit, Julius said, pulling out a chair for her. Aisha hesitated. I don't think I'm supposed to eat with you. Nonsense. He waved off her protest. You work here now. You should eat well. She sat down, feeling a little out of place. The food was unlike anything she had ever tasted. Grilled fish, fresh vegetables, soft bread. Every bite melted in her mouth. She tried to eat slowly, but her hunger betrayed her. Julius chuckled. Good. She nodded, mouth too full to speak. For a while, they ate in comfortable silence. Then Julius spoke again. What's your biggest fear, Aisha? She paused, ending up stuck in the same cycle forever. Working just to survive, never really living. Julius nodded, as if he understood. And what's your biggest dream? Aisha smiled slightly. To own a restaurant. A small one. Not fancy, just a place where people can come and eat good food. Julius studied her for a moment. A simple dream. But a good one, she said firmly. He nodded. Yes, a very good one. In Deli's office, the tension was thick. He tossed the photo on his desk and turned to the investigator. Find out exactly where he is. I need proof. The investigator nodded. Understood. As the man left, Deli leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple. If his father was truly alive, the inheritance wouldn't come so easily. That couldn't happen. He had waited too long for this fortune. He needed a plan. Aisha spent the rest of the day in the mansion, following Julius around as he asked her more strange questions. He asked about love, betrayal, kindness, hardship. It felt less like a job and more like a test, but for what, she didn't know. When the evening came, Mrs. Adewale showed her to a small but beautiful room. The bed was soft, the air smelled like lavender. For the first time in years, Aisha didn't have to worry about rats or leaking roofs. She lay down, staring at the ceiling. This was the strangest day of her life. But, deep down, she had a feeling it was only the beginning. Back at the Odwale mansion, Julius sat alone in his study, staring at an old photograph of himself with his son, Deli, from years ago. I wonder, he murmured to himself, what kind of man have you become, my son? Outside, hidden in the darkness, the investigator snapped another photo. Julius Odwale was alive. And soon, the whole world would know. Aisha stood frozen in front of the television screen, the news anchor's voice ringing in her ears. Breaking news. Business mogul Julius Odwell has been confirmed dead. Sources say the billionaire passed away months ago, and arrangements are already being made regarding his estate. The Odwell family has declined to comment at this time. She turned to Julius, who sat calmly in his chair, one leg crossed over the other, watching the screen as if they were announcing the weather. Her head spun. They said you're dead. Julius picked up his tea, took a slow sip, and let out a dry chuckle. Interesting. Interesting. Aisha nearly shouted. That's all you have to say? The whole country thinks you're dead. Your family. Want me dead? Julius finished, setting his cup down. That's the real news. Aisha stared at him. You're not surprised? Not even a little, he said, stretching his legs. I was wondering when they'd pull this trick. Aisha's mind raced. But why? Why would they do this? Julius leaned back, staring at her, as if deciding how much to say. Finally, he sighed. Some people smile at you while digging your grave. The way he said it sent a chill down her spine. Meanwhile, at the Odwell mansion, Deli Odwell tapped his fingers impatiently on the polished glass table. The air in the grand study was tense, filled with hushed murmurs from the gathered family members. Chief Omalade, Julius's younger brother, stood at the head of the table, straightening his agbada. Now that the news is out, the company has no choice but to act. They'll begin the legal transfer soon. Deli smirked, swirling a glass of whiskey in his hand. And what if someone questions it? They'll want proof. Chief Omalade gave a slow, calculating smile. Who would dare challenge us? If the board hesitates, we'll present them with official documents. After all, a man missing for months, presumed dead with no sign of life? It's enough. A younger cousin shifted nervously. But what if he shows up? Deli's grip tightened around his glass, but his expression didn't change. He won't. The room fell silent, his words lingering like an unspoken threat. Back at the mansion on the outskirts, Aisha paced the floor, her mind buzzing with questions. Julius, however, seemed almost amused by the situation. You should do something, she blurted out. You should go back and prove them wrong. Julius chuckled, shaking his head. Aisha, if I walk through those doors right now, what do you think will happen? She frowned. They'll be shocked, obviously. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. And then, Aisha hesitated. Then, they'll have no choice but to accept you're alive? Julius smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. And what if they make sure I don't stay alive for long? Aisha's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't thought about that. Julius sighed, rubbing his temples. Deli and Omalade are vultures. They won't stop until the company is in their hands. Me being alive is an inconvenience. And inconveniences get taken care of. Aisha sat down, suddenly feeling small. So what will you do? Julius didn't answer immediately. He picked up a remote and turned off the news. Let's wait and see how far they're willing to go. Aisha frowned. You're going to let them think you're dead? He smiled at her, a mischievous glint in his eye. For now, over the next few days, the news of Julius Odwell's death spread like wildfire. Business analysts speculated on the future of his empire. Social media buzzed with tribute posts, and the stock market reacted in waves. The Odwell family played their roles perfectly, making tearful appearances and releasing carefully crafted statements. But Aisha saw Julius every day, sipping tea, reading newspapers, very much alive. It was both unsettling and fascinating. One evening, as she set a plate of food before him, she asked, "Doesn't it bother you? Watching them lie?" Julius smiled. "Oh, it bothers me. But I've learned that when people think they've won, they get sloppy." Aisha sat across from him, playing with her spoon. "Do you think they'll stop here?" He looked at her for a long moment. "No." Meanwhile, at the Odwell mansion, Deli took a slow, deep breath. While in a secret meeting with his private investigator, he ordered him find out exactly where he is. And if he's alive. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The next morning, Aisha was helping Mrs. Adewale in the kitchen when Julius walked in, holding his phone with an amused look on his face. "Well, Aisha, looks like our friends are getting nervous." She wiped her hands on a towel. "What happened?" Julius held up his phone. Delhi has ordered an investigation. Aisha's stomach tightened. They're looking for you? Julius nodded, chuckling. They expected me to be 6 feet under by now. The idea that I might not be is inconvenient for them. Aisha swallowed. So what do we do? Julius set his phone down, tapping his fingers on the table. We let them come. She stared at him. You're not scared? He smiled. Fear is for people with something to lose. I lost everything the day I realized my own blood wanted me gone. Now, I'm just playing the game. Aisha had no idea what kind of game he was talking about, but one thing was clear, this wasn't over. Not even close. That night, as the city slept, a black car rolled slowly past the gates of the mansion where Julius was hiding. A shadowed figure sat in the back seat, peering through binoculars. The investigator lowered his binoculars, pulling out his phone. Boss, we have a problem. On the other end of the call, Delhi Odwale's expression darkened. What is it? The investigator hesitated. Julius Odwale is alive. There was a pause. Then Delhi's voice, cold and calm. Are you sure? The investigator swallowed. Yes, I saw him myself. Another pause. Then a slow, chilling reply. Then we moved to the next step. The call ended. The car disappeared into the night. And the real game began. Aisha hurried down the crowded street, her heart pounding as she replayed the landlord's words in her head. I've been patient enough. If you and your friend can't pay by the end of today, you're both out. She had pleaded, begged for a little more time, but it was useless. The man had no sympathy left. Now, as she approached the tiny apartment she shared with Zainab, dread settled in her stomach. She pushed open the door to find Zainab sitting on the floor, surrounded by their few belongings. Zainab's eyes were red from crying. Aisha, we have to leave. Aisha's knees weakened. No, he actually threw us out? Zainab sniffled, nodding. Some men came this afternoon, tossed our things outside like we were trash. Aisha clenched her fists. Where will we go? Zainab wiped her face and gave a bitter laugh. I don't know, but I can't stay on the street, Aisha. My cousin in Ibadan said I could come. Aisha's chest tightened. Ibadan? But that's far. You don't even have transport money. Zainab sighed. I'll figure it out. But you, what will you do? Aisha sat beside her, shoulders slumped. I don't know. Silence stretched between them. Then, Zainab took Aisha's hand. You have that job at the mansion now. Maybe this is a blessing in disguise. Aisha swallowed hard. She had a roof over her head for now, but how long would it last? The next morning, she rushed to the restaurant, determined to at least keep her job. Madame Ngozi was already at the counter, frowning at a customer who was waving a spoon in the air. This is unacceptable. My food is too salty, the man shouted. Aisha quickly tied her apron and stepped forward. Sir, I can get you another plate. The man barely looked at her. I don't want another plate. I want to know why a thief is serving me food. Aisha blinked. What? The man pointed at her. I saw her steal money from the counter yesterday. Aisha's heart dropped. That's a lie. Madame Ngozi's eyes narrowed. Aisha, is this true? Aisha felt her hand shake. Madam, I would never steal. You know me. The customer scoffed. Then why was I short on my change after you served me? Madame Ngozi's lips pressed together. Aisha, I can't have thieves in my restaurant. I didn't do anything. Aisha shouted, voice breaking. Madame Ngozi sighed. Whether you did or not, I can't take chances. You're fired. Aisha gasped. Madam, please. Leave. Tears burned Aisha's eyes. She turned and walked out, each step feeling heavier than the last. By the time she reached the mansion, she was numb. She walked into the sitting room and sank onto a chair, staring at nothing. Julius watched her from his usual spot. He set down his tea. Rough day. Aisha gave a hollow laugh. You could say that. He leaned forward. Tell me. She hesitated, then sighed. Zainab and I lost our home. She left for Ibadan, and I got fired over something I didn't do. Julius listened, his expression unreadable. So what now? Aisha bit her lip. I don't know. For the first time in a long while, she had nowhere to go. No plan. No idea how to move forward. Julius sipped his tea. Do you want my advice? Aisha blinked. You have advice? He chuckled. Of course. I've lived long enough to know that life is unfair. But the thing about unfairness is that it forces you to be stronger. Aisha frowned. So, I should just accept it? Julius tilted his head. No, but don't let it break you. Aisha scoffed. Easy for you to say. Julius smiled. You think money protects people from suffering? She crossed her arms. Doesn't it? Julius leaned back. You'd be surprised. Aisha sighed, rubbing her face. I just don't get it. Why do bad things always happen to people who are just trying to survive? Julius was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, because the world doesn't reward struggle. It rewards persistence. Aisha stared at him. So what? I should just keep going? Julius nodded. You're still standing, aren't you? She let out a small, dry laugh. Barely. Julius tapped his fingers on the table. Barely is still something. Aisha looked away, eyes stinging. She didn't want to cry in front of this man. Not when she had spent her whole life pretending to be fine. Julius stood. Come. She frowned. Where? He smirked. You'll see. Aisha hesitated, then followed him out to the garden. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the trimmed hedges and colorful flowers. Julius pointed to a small tree. That tree was planted 5 years ago. It almost died last year because of bad soil. But look at it now. Aisha raised an eyebrow. You're comparing me to a tree? Julius chuckled. I'm saying that growth doesn't happen easily. But it happens. Aisha crossed her arms. That tree didn't have a landlord kicking it out. Julius laughed. No, but it had storms. You're not the only one facing hardship, Aisha. Everyone has battles. Some are just better at hiding them. Aisha sighed. And what if I don't want to fight anymore? Julius looked at her, his gaze steady. Then you let life win. Aisha looked away. She didn't want life to win. But she was so tired. Julius patted her shoulder. You remind me of someone I used to know. She frowned. Who? Julius smiled, a faraway look in his eyes. A boy who thought the world was against him, until he learned how to fight back. Aisha tilted her head. What happened to him? Julius chuckled. He became very, very rich. Aisha snorted. So money does solve problems. Julius smirked. Not all of them. They stood in silence, watching the wind move through the leaves. Finally, Aisha whispered, I just wish something good would happen for once. Julius looked at her. It will. Aisha let out a slow breath. Maybe, just maybe he was right. That night, as she lay in her small room in the mansion, she thought about everything she had lost. But she also thought about what Julius had said. She wasn't broken yet. And maybe, just maybe, she wasn't done fighting. Deli paced back and forth in the grand Oldwale mansion, his patience wearing thin. We need to act fast, he muttered, running a hand through his hair. The longer father stays alive, the harder it will be to claim our inheritance. Chief Omelade, his uncle, sat back in his chair, twirling a gold ring on his finger. He smirked. Patience, my dear nephew. Wealth is not taken in haste, it's taken in silence. And I have just the plan. Deli narrowed his eyes. What plan? You keep saying that, but father is still breathing. Omelade leaned forward. I've spoken to a certain doctor, one who values money over morals. He works at the private hospital father once visited. He has agreed to help us. Deli raised an eyebrow. Ow! Omelade's smirk deepened. By ensuring Julius takes a special dose of medication, one that will send him to his grave quietly. No suspicions, no messy accidents, just natural death. Deli hesitated. Poison? Want to do an autopsy? Omelade waved dismissively. Not if it's done properly. It will mimic a stroke. And since father has been in hiding, no one will question it. Deli exhaled slowly, his expression hardening. Fine. Make the call. Meanwhile, in the mansion on the outskirts of Velmer City, Aisha was finishing up Julius's evening tea. She had grown used to her strange job, sitting with him, listening to his stories, sometimes even making him laugh. Julius had changed in the weeks she'd known him. At first, he had seemed cold, distant. But now, he often smiled at her, even if it was small. Sometimes, he asked about her life. Sometimes, he just enjoyed the silence. But tonight, something fell off. As she was carrying his tea tray back to the kitchen, She heard hushed voices coming from the hallway. She slowed her steps. "Are you sure we'll work?" A deep voice whispered. "Perfectly." Another voice, smoother, calmer, replied. "The dose is subtle. It will take a few days, but it will be fatal. He won't even know what's happening." Aisha's breath caught in her throat. She peeked around the corner and saw a man in a white coat speaking into his phone. A doctor. Her heart pounded as she recognized him. Dr. Mensah, the private doctor who had visited Julius a few times before. She pressed herself against the wall, forcing herself to stay calm. She couldn't hear everything, but she caught enough. Someone was trying to poison Julius. Aisha spent the rest of the night in a daze. She couldn't stop thinking about what she had overheard. Was Julius really in danger? And if so, who would want to harm him? She clenched her fists. His family. It had to be them. She had heard whispers about how powerful they were, how greedy they were. But this was evil. She couldn't let it happen. The next morning, Dr. Mensah arrived at the mansion, carrying a small case of medicine. Aisha watched from the doorway, her stomach twisting with nerves. She saw him hand the medication to the house nurse, smiling as if nothing was wrong. "Make sure he takes this with his meals," Dr. Mensah said smoothly. "It will strengthen his heart." Lies. Aisha felt a chill go down her spine. As soon as the doctor left, she hurried to the medicine cabinet. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The new bottle sat neatly on the shelf. She swallowed. She had to switch it. But how? That night, Aisha waited until the mansion was quiet. The nurses had left for the evening, and Julius was already asleep. She crept into the kitchen and carefully unscrewed the cap of the poison medicine. She didn't know much about medicine, but she knew one thing. Julius could not take this. She glanced around, then quickly dumped the contents into the sink. The clear liquid disappeared down the drain. Her hand shook as she replaced the bottle with an old and used one she had found in the cabinet. She filled it with harmless vitamins. It wasn't the same medicine, but it would buy her time to figure out what to do next. As she placed the bottle back, she exhaled shakily. She had just done something dangerous, but it was worth it. Julius Odwale was not dying on her watch. The next morning, Aisha brought Julius his breakfast as usual. He eyed her as she set down his tea and plate of toast. "You're unusually quiet today," he observed. "Something troubling you?" Aisha hesitated, forcing a small smile. "Just tired." Julius didn't look convinced, but he didn't press her further. Instead, he sipped his tea and leaned back. "Strange thing," he said suddenly. "My doctor sent new medication yesterday, but I don't feel any different." Aisha's fingers curled around the edge of the tray. "Maybe it takes time." Julius gave her a knowing look. "Or maybe someone doesn't want it to work." Aisha's stomach flipped. Did he suspect something? Was he testing her? She forced herself to stay calm. Why would someone do that? Julius smiled faintly. "Because not everyone smiles at you with good intentions." Aisha swallowed. She wanted to tell him everything. To warn him. But what if he didn't believe her? What if he thought she was overreacting? Before she could decide, a loud knock echoed through the house. Aisha turned sharply toward the door. Something in her gut told her this wasn't good. A guard entered the room, looking serious. "Sir, a man claiming to be your son is here. He wants to see you." Aisha's breath caught. Julius's expression darkened. "Tell him I'm not here." The guard nodded and left. Aisha turned to Julius, heart racing. "Your son?" Julius sighed. "Deli. The only thing he ever wanted from me was my wealth." Aisha hesitated, then whispered, What if he's not just here for your money?" Julius raised an eyebrow. "Then what is he here for?" Aisha met his gaze. "Something worse." Julius stared at her for a long moment, then smiled slightly. "You're sharper than I thought." Aisha swallowed hard. She had done what she could, but she had a feeling this battle wasn't over yet. And for the first time, she wasn't sure if she was ready for what was coming next. The mansion's atmosphere was heavy with tension. Aisha's heart pounded as she cleared Julius's breakfast tray, her mind racing after their conversation about Deli. Julius knew something was coming. So did she. Before she could gather her thoughts, loud voices echoed from the grand hallway. Aisha froze, then slowly peeked through the slightly open dining room door. Two sharply dressed men had stepped inside, their presence immediately filling the space with an air of arrogance and calculation. Deli Odwale and Chief Omelade. Julius sat calmly at the head of the table, swirling his tea as if their arrival was of no concern. Aisha, now standing behind him, felt the air shift. "My dear father," Deli began, spreading his arms with a forced smile. "You have no idea how relieved we are to see you alive." Julius chuckled, set his cup down. "Relieved?" He raised an eyebrow. "Funny, considering I was supposed to be dead." Omelade, ever the smooth talker, let out a deep laugh. "Come now, brother. There was no proof of life, and we feared the worst." He took a step forward. "We only wanted to ensure your legacy was protected." Aisha clenched her fists. "Liars." Julius met their gazes steadily. "And what legacy is that?" Deli sighed dramatically. "Father, there's no need for hostility. We just want you to come home. The company, the estate, everything is in chaos without you. The family needs you." Julius leaned back, unimpressed. "The family needs me, or my assets." Silence. Omelade's lips curled into a smirk. "Why must you always assume the worst? You've been away long enough. It's time to let us take care of things. Let's not make this difficult." Aisha noticed the way Julius's fingers tapped lightly against the table. He was waiting for something. A few moments later, a butler entered, carrying a tray of water and Julius's evening medication. Aisha's breath caught. That was supposed to be the poison dose, but she had already switched it. She glanced at the butler's face. Neutral, unaware. Deli's eyes flickered toward the bottle as it was set in front of Julius. He quickly masked his expression, but Aisha saw the flicker of anticipation. This was her moment. "Drink up, father," Deli said with a smile. "You need your strength." Julius picked up the small cup of water, but didn't drink yet. He turned to Aisha. "Would you mind pouring a glass for our dear guests?" Aisha hesitated for only a second before nodding. She moved to the drink cart, filling 2 glasses. Omelade accepted his drink, chuckling. "Ah, a warm welcome at last." Deli, however, didn't touch his. His eyes were on Julius, watching, waiting. Julius finally reached for the medication bottle. He unscrewed the cap, tipping 2 pills into his palm. His gaze flickered toward Deli and Omelade, unreadable. Then he did something unexpected. He turned to Dr. Mensah, who had just entered the room, looking slightly nervous. "My dear doctor," Julius said smoothly, holding out the pills. "I trust you've been overseeing my health properly?" Dr. Mensah hesitated. "Of course, sir." Julius nodded. "Then you won't mind demonstrating their safety." Silence. Omelade's smirk faltered. Deli stiffened. Dr. Mensah let out a forced chuckle. "Sir, this medication is specifically tailored to your condition. It wouldn't be right for me." "Nonsense," Julius interrupted. His voice was calm, but there was an undeniable sharpness to it. A good doctor would never prescribe something they wouldn't take themselves. "Go on." Dr. Mensah's forehead glistened with sweat. His hand shook slightly as he took the pills Julius offered. The entire room watched as he hesitated. Then, with no other choice, he swallowed them. Seconds passed, then a minute. Then Dr. Mensah gasped. He stumbled back, gripping his throat, his face contorting in horror. The room burst into chaos. He coughed violently, his knees giving way as he collapsed onto the floor. Deli shot up from his chair. "What's happening?" Julius remained seated, his expression unreadable. Aisha took a step back as Dr. Mensah writhed on the ground. The realization hit her like a thunderbolt. She had switched the medicine. Dr. Mensah must have assumed it was still poisoned. He had taken his own intended trap. The doctor choked, his body twitching, before going eerily still. Omelade paled. "What the?" Julius finally spoke. "I knew what you were planning." His voice was calm, cold. "And you let your own greed set your downfall." Deli's face turned white. This wasn't. Julius stood up slowly. The aura around him shifted. He no longer looked like the frail man hiding from his own family. He looked like the powerful businessman they had all once feared. "I spent years building everything we have," Julius said, stepping closer to them. "I made sure our family would never know poverty. And how do you repay me? Omalade swallowed hard. Brother, silence. Omalade's mouth snapped shut. Julius turned to the butler. Call the police. Deli's eyes widened. No, father, wait. Julius held up a hand, cutting him off. You tried to kill me. You lied to the world about my death. And for what? A fortune you didn't earn? Aisha watched as Deli's bravado crumbled. Omalade, usually so composed, looked like a man who had just realized his time was up. The mansion's guards entered moments later, alerted by the commotion. Julius gestured towards Deli and Omalade. Escort them out. The guards hesitated. Deli and Omalade were family, after all. But one glance at Julius's face, and they obeyed. Deli struggled. You can't do this to us. Julius didn't blink. I just did. As the guards dragged them away, Aisha exhaled. The weight of the moment crashed onto her. She had just witnessed something that felt straight out of a movie. When the house fell silent again, Julius turned to her. For the first time, he truly looked at her. Not as a servant, not as a stranger, but as someone who had just saved his life. You switched the medicine, didn't you? Aisha hesitated before nodding. I couldn't let them hurt you. Julius's lips curved slightly. Smart girl. She felt warmth spread through her chest. Julius turned toward the window, watching as Deli and Omalade were taken away. He exhaled slowly. I knew betrayal would come eventually, he murmured. I just didn't expect to find loyalty in a stranger. Aisha smiled, though she felt an odd heaviness. Things weren't over. Not yet. But for now, Julius Odwale had won, and she had helped him do it. The sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder by the second. Aisha stood frozen as the reality of everything settled in. The lifeless body of Dr. Mensah lay on the floor. Deli and Omalade had just been dragged away by the guards, and Julius Odwale, alive, sharp, and unshaken, watched it all unfold with an unreadable expression. Within minutes, the police stormed the mansion, their heavy boots echoing through the grand hallway. Aisha stepped aside as the officers entered, her heart still racing from the chaos of the night. Mr. Odwale, one of the officers, a middle-aged man with a stern face, addressed Julius. We received an urgent call about an attempted poisoning. Julius nodded and gestured towards the body on the floor. That man, he said calmly, was a doctor hired by my brother and son. He attempted to poison me. The officer crouched beside Dr. Mensah, checking his pulse. He shook his head and stood. He's gone. There was no remorse in Julius's eyes. No sadness. Just a cold acceptance. The officer turned to the guards, who were still holding Deli and Omalade outside. We'll take them into custody for questioning. Deli struggled against the grip of the officers. This is ridiculous. My father is senile. He doesn't know what he's saying. I'm his son. Julius finally walked over, his steps slow, deliberate. He stared at Deli with an expression so piercing it made Aisha shiver. You're no son of mine, Julius said quietly, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. Deli flinched, his bravado fading. Dad, please. Julius raised a hand, silencing him. Take them. The officers didn't hesitate. They dragged Deli and Omalade out of the house, ignoring their protests. The heavy front doors shut behind them, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the chaos before. Aisha finally let out a shaky breath. Julius turned to her. His sharp eyes studied her face, and for the first time, he gave her a small smile. You switched the medicine, he said. It wasn't a question. He already knew. Aisha swallowed. I had a feeling something was wrong. I couldn't let you die. Julius nodded approvingly. Smart girl. He walked over to the dining table and sat down as if the evening hadn't just turned into a crime scene. Come, sit, he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Aisha hesitated but obeyed, her hands still slightly trembling. She had no idea what was going to happen next. Julius tapped his fingers on the polished wood. Tell me, Aisha, why did you help me that night in the rain? She blinked at the sudden change of topic. What? The night we met, Julius clarified. You gave me your last money. You could have ignored me like everyone else. But you didn't. What? Aisha shifted in her seat. I don't know. I guess. I just couldn't leave you there like that. You looked like you needed help. Julius chuckled softly. Even when you barely had anything yourself? She shrugged. My mother always said kindness is free. If I could help, even in a small way, why wouldn't I? Julius leaned back, rubbing his chin. You know, Aisha, I've spent decades surrounded by wealth, by powerful people. But do you know what I rarely see? She shook her head. Genuine kindness. His voice was thoughtful, almost distant. People do things for gain. They help because they expect something in return. But you? You gave without expecting anything. Aisha looked down, suddenly feeling shy. I didn't do anything special. Julius smiled. That's where you're wrong. Silence stretched between them before he finally spoke again. I needed to see if genuine kindness still exists, he admitted. I disappeared from my world, from my family, because I wanted to know who truly cared. You were a stranger, yet you're the only one who treated me with dignity when I had nothing. Aisha frowned slightly. So, you were testing me? Julius chuckled. In a way. But I didn't expect you to pass so spectacularly. Aisha exhaled, feeling both overwhelmed and relieved. So what happens now? Julius's expression turned serious. Now, I reward loyalty. Aisha's eyes widened. Sir, Julius stood, gesturing for her to follow. Confused, she did. He led her through the grand halls of the mansion until they reached his study. He pushed the heavy doors open and walked straight to his desk, pulling open a drawer. He turned back to her and held out an envelope. This is for you. Aisha hesitated before taking it. Her fingers trembled as she opened it, revealing a check. Her breath hitched. She had never seen so many zeros in her life. This, her voice wavered. This can change my life. Julius nodded. That's the point. Tears pricked her eyes. She thought about Zainab, about their rent struggles, about how she had lost her job. This was a miracle. Julius studied her reaction. You deserve it, Aisha. And not just this. I want you to work for me. Not as a maid. As someone I trust. Aisha's mouth fell open. You what? Julius smirked. I don't trust easily. But you've proven yourself. And I believe in rewarding those who show true character. Aisha's heart pounded. I don't even know what to say. Say yes. She swallowed hard, her mind racing. This was more than she had ever imagined. More than she had ever dared to dream. Finally, she met his gaze. Yes. Julius smiled. Good. As she stood there, holding the check in her trembling hands, she realized something. Her kindness, her struggles, her pain, it had all led to this moment. And for the first time in a long time, Aisha felt like her life was about to change forever. Aisha sat in stunned silence, the weight of Julius's words settling in her heart. She had spent years struggling, working herself to exhaustion just to survive. Now, in the blink of an eye, everything had changed. You bought a house for Zainab? She finally managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. Julius nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. I did. She will never have to worry about rent again. Aisha's hands trembled as she covered her mouth, her eyes welling up with tears. I don't know what to say. Say you'll accept it, Julius said simply. Both the job and the house. Say you'll take this opportunity and make the best of it. Aisha's emotions crashed over her like a tidal wave. Gratitude, disbelief, hope, all tangled together in her chest. She had spent so long fighting just to stay afloat, and now, for the first time, someone was offering her a lifeline. Julius studied her carefully. I chose you, Aisha, because when you had nothing, you still chose kindness. She let out a shaky breath, his words echoing in her mind. Kindness. Such a simple thing, yet it had led her here to this moment. She nodded slowly. I accept. Julius's smile widened, and he extended a hand. Then welcome to your new life. Aisha hesitated for only a second before shaking his hand, sealing the beginning of a chapter she had never dared to dream of. The next day, Aisha walked into the mansion with a sense of purpose. She wasn't just a visitor anymore. This was her workplace, her fresh start. Julius had given her a position as his personal assistant, a role she wasn't entirely sure she was ready for, but she was determined to prove herself. Morning, Miss Aisha, one of the house staff, a middle-aged woman named Tolu, greeted her warmly. Welcome aboard. Aisha smiled shyly. Thank you, Ma. You don't have to call me Ma. Tolu chuckled. We're all colleagues now. The idea felt strange to Aisha. She had spent years working under strict bosses who barely acknowledged her existence. Now, she was being treated as an equal. Julius entered the room, dressed sharply in a tailored suit. He looked every bit the powerful businessman he had once been before his self-imposed disappearance. Aisha, he said, gesturing for her to follow him into his study. We have work to do. She hurried after him, still slightly in awe of everything happening so fast. Julius sat at his massive desk and motioned for her to sit opposite him. Your first task, he said, sliding a folder toward her, is to familiarize yourself with these. Aisha opened the folder and saw financial statements, company reports, and legal documents. Her stomach tightened. Sir, I don't know anything about this. Julius leaned back, studying her. Then you'll learn. Aisha swallowed hard. But what if I mess up? Julius chuckled. Then you try again. Mistakes don't scare me, Aisha. A lack of effort does. She nodded slowly, his words settling in. This was a challenge, but it was one she was willing to face. Later that evening, Aisha visited Zainab at their old apartment, barely able to contain her excitement. Zainab, she called as she stepped inside the tiny, cramped room they had shared for years. Zainab, who had been sitting on the floor, counting coin for their next meal, looked up. Aisha? What's wrong? Aisha grinned, holding up an envelope. Pack your things. Zainab frowned. What? We're moving, Aisha said, unable to keep the joy from her voice. Julius bought us a house. Zainab's eyes widened. A house? As in an actual house? Aisha nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. We'll never have to worry about rent again. For a moment, Zainab was silent. Then, suddenly, she launched herself at Aisha, hugging her tightly. You did this? She whispered. Aisha shook her head. No, kindness did. They both cried, years of struggle washing away in that single moment. Days turned into weeks, and Aisha threw herself into her new job with determination. She studied every document Julius gave her, learning quickly. She sat in on meetings, observed how he made decisions, and absorbed everything like a sponge. One evening, as she was reviewing some files in the study, Julius walked in and placed a steaming cup of tea beside her. You work hard, he noted. Aisha looked up, surprised. I don't want to disappoint you. Julius chuckled. Aisha, you have already exceeded my expectations. Her heart swelled with pride. You remind me of myself when I was younger, he continued. Hungry for more. Eager to learn. Aisha's eyes widened. I do, Julius nodded. And that's why I know you'll do great things. For the first time, Aisha allowed herself to believe it. One evening, Aisha and Zainab sat on the porch of their new home, sipping tea and watching the sunset. Can you believe this is our life now? Zainab asked, shaking her head in disbelief. Aisha smiled, feeling at peace for the first time in years. No, but I'm grateful. Zainab nudged her playfully. So, are you going to marry a billionaire next? Aisha laughed. I think I'll focus on building my career first. Zainab grinned. Good answer. As the sky turned shades of orange and pink, Aisha closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She had been through storms. She had faced struggles that had nearly broken her. But through it all, she had chosen kindness. And now, kindness had chosen her back. Julius watched from his car as Aisha laughed with Zainab. He sipped his tea thoughtfully, a small smile on his face. He had been right about her. She was special, and he couldn't wait to see what she would do next. News of Julius Odwell's return spread like wildfire across Velmer City. The headlines were bold and dramatic. Billionaire returns from the dead. Julius Odwell's family exposed. Delhi and Omalade lose everything. Aisha sat in her office, staring at her phone screen, scrolling through the countless articles. Every major news outlet was covering the shocking twist. The once powerful Delhi and Omalade had been stripped of their access to the family fortune, their influence shattered overnight. Their desperate attempt to declare Julius dead had backfired spectacularly. Serves him right, Zainab muttered, reading over Aisha's shoulder. They wanted to take everything from him, and now they have nothing. Aisha sighed, setting her phone down. I don't want to celebrate someone else's downfall, even if they were cruel. Zainab raised an eyebrow. You way too nice, Aisha. I would have thrown a party by now. Aisha chuckled. I just hope they learned something from this. Meanwhile, at a luxury hotel where Deli had been staying, he sat with his head in his hands. The weight of his actions had finally caught up with him. Omalade paced the room, frustration evident in every movement. This isn't over, Omalade muttered. We can still fight this. Deli scoffed. Fight what? We lost. Dad made sure of that. Omalade stopped pacing and turned to face him. So what now? Do we just give up? Deli exhaled heavily. Maybe we should have just been better sons. For the first time, Omalade had nothing to say. Julius returned to his mansion, where his loyal staff welcomed him back with tears of joy. He had spent months away, testing the world, testing the people around him. And in Aisha, he had found proof that goodness still existed. Sitting in his study, Julius watched Aisha from the window as she prepared for another outing. He had noticed how, despite her new life, she never forgot where she came from. Curious, he followed her from a distance, watching as she made her way back to her old neighborhood. Aisha walked the familiar streets, passing the tiny roadside shops, the same food stalls where she once bought her meals after long shifts. But today, she wasn't here for herself. She had come with a mission. She approached a group of women who were gathered near a small, run-down restaurant. They were workers just like she had once been, tired, underpaid, struggling to make ends meet. With a warm smile, Aisha handed each of them a small envelope. One of the women, a mother of 3, hesitated before taking it. What is this? She asked. A little help, Aisha replied gently. No strings attached. The woman's eyes filled with tears. But why? Aisha smiled. Because I know what it's like to need kindness. Word spread quickly, and soon people in the neighborhood began to notice what Aisha was doing. She wasn't flaunting her success. She wasn't seeking attention. She was simply giving back, quietly and sincerely. She even visited Madame Ngozi's restaurant, the very place where she had been fired. Stepping inside, she saw the familiar sight of workers rushing around, customers yelling orders, and Madame Ngozi barking instructions. Aisha. Madame Ngozi's eyes widened when she spotted her. Is that you? Aisha smiled. Yes, ma. Madame Ngozi folded her arms. You look different. Aisha chuckled. Life has been kind. The older woman studied her for a moment before sighing. I heard about everything. About Mr. Odwale. About what you did for him. Aisha said nothing, waiting for her to continue. Madame Ngozi finally sighed. I was hard on you, I know. Maybe too hard. But I always saw potential in you. Aisha nodded. I learn a lot here. Even the tough times taught me something. Madame Ngozi hesitated before adding, if you ever want to start something of your own, I have a few contacts. Maybe I could help. Aisha smiled. Thank you, Ma. She left the restaurant feeling lighter, as if she had finally closed a chapter of her life. That evening, as Aisha walked home, she passed a street corner where a beggar sat, his tattered clothes barely shielding him from the night's cold air. She paused. For a moment, it felt like déjà vu. She remembered that rainy night, the moment that had changed her life forever. Without hesitation, she reached into her purse, pulled out some money, and handed it to the beggar. He looked up at her, surprised. Thank you, miss. God bless you. Aisha smiled. Take care of yourself. As she walked away, she felt a presence beside her. Julius had been watching from a distance, and now stepped forward to walk beside her. You didn't even think twice, he noted. Aisha glanced at him. Should I have? Julius chuckled. No, that's what makes you who you are. They walked in comfortable silence for a moment before Julius spoke again. So what's next for you? Aisha took a deep breath, looking up at the night sky. I don't know, but whatever it is, I'll make sure it counts. Julius nodded approvingly. Good answer. As they continued down the street, Aisha felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Life had tested her, broken her down, but she had come out stronger. And now, she was ready for whatever came next. Because she knew one thing for certain. kindness always finds its way back. If you found this story engaging, don't just watch, be part of the journey. Hit the like button to show your support, drop a comment to share your thoughts, and most importantly, subscribe so you never miss another powerful story. And if you know someone who would enjoy this, share it with them, your friends, colleagues, and family.